2, 1, go. In short, governments that are poor have to constantly fund their citizens even after relegating their economic power to the free market. Hence, even if it is the state's role to provide reliability mechanisms, they still do not have the highest economic control. As a state, we uphold safety and sustainability of citizens over faulty principle, which opposition has never proved why it's going to be sustainable for the people. This is important because inside opposition, what happens is half-assed welfare programs where transition is not properly facilitated, so they fall back to government programs anyway, which makes the program effectively just as costly as if it were invested on. In our side, with proper facilitation, we allow people who are dealing with financial troubles get jobs, gain financial independence, and gain their own agency outside of government independence, right? This is important with the existing framing on PM because the moment governments have relinquished their economic power to capitalism, it is now capitalism's let's say, for example, co-responsibility to financially cater to them as holders of the economy, especially when disabled and poor individuals also want to gain jobs. We allow their choice to be further pursued rather than ignored for the sake of consistent government failures when they are opportunity locked inside opposition, especially when governments now have to, and this is the excessive flip in their side, have the excuse to lay off stimulus checks and social services off anyway when they find it codependent and ineffective. At least we force the state to fund the transition rather than the resources. So the layoff is an extremely detrimental to these people because we have provided safety nets rather than resources. This kills LO and pure logic because assuming the trends exist and pressure happens, the problem is that the rise is happening in status quo in real life. LO is debating in debate land. This is how I flip the burden pushed by vibe checking the reality of their case. In status quo, hospitals still exist, stimulus checks still exist, social services still exist. Even with opportunity cost, none of these benefits are mutually exclusive because they are still essential industries. So assuming you get excluded from these welfare to work programs, they get stimulus checks. I don't know why this is complicated to understand. In fact, on the case of predictability, we gain more predictability through insistent surveillance and compliance checks. This is the data you need to process. They do not prove why surveillance and compliance is such a bad thing, especially when you're literally benefiting from a government program. The surveillance allows for proper scouting of social service activities, so they have more reasons to be able to fund you. That is the point. It's a trade-off. You need to comply to get the welfare to work program because you're literally going to work. It is in their side where you just give them money and food based off of need, and you do not give them prerequisites for proper job transitions, for proper, let's say, for example, accountability funds, and assume they have the agency to work and then blame them for not working because the stigma still happens in their side. When complacency happens anyway, we want nations to fund the transition to independence, not to fund whatever they decide is important. They also do not prove why menial jobs are even a bad thing. This is the worst case coming from LO, especially if they come from a place of unemployment. Notice they exaggerate harms without understanding if these harms are actually harmful to someone who has nothing left. This is how opposition loses. Inside up, they are unemployable, but in our side, our mothers are nurses. They have jobs. So even if they get exploited, worst case, by the way, they are working, they get money. In your side, they will get killed by a demolition by the same state giving them stimulus checks. In fact, when the transition is institutionalized, you allow the state to monitor their workplace and allow them to gain better work systems at the very end of the day. This is very important because the opportunity cost still happens in your side because you still have these welfare to work programs because you're going to regret the rise, but you're not going to regret it at the very end of the day. So in your counterfactual, you'd still have to deal with trying to fund these things and having to see them fail. What have I proved? 3 things. 1, the state does not have the social justification anymore to be the sole providers of the masses, and so we also need accountability for corporations coming from PM and DPM. 2, that suddenly losing hospitals and stimulus checks is a lie because these are different agencies and different social services. In fact, losing these hospitals are worse when you lose the workforce pipeline for nurses because surprise, you don't have people taking up those jobs due to the lack of the program. Thirdly, we provide much more reliable and predictable systems that allow surveillance and safety nets for the masses, while opposition does not provide them, wait for them to be poor, and then give them what they quote-unquote need. How does DLO further destroy their case then? They talk about how people are now pressured to get jobs or they do not get benefits. 1, I already proved this is a lie because you can still get stimulus checks anyway. 2, assuming governments disallow you to get social services because you do not have a job, you can sue the agency because this is illegal. This is not a new case, it's just proper pragmatics. 3, the stigma still exists anyway, but in your side, you make them more hit by stigma because you do not give them a proper transition to a job. So if they do want to get a job, they will be made fun of more and they have more barriers to get to not be able to get a job. So if DLO talks about how they are incentivized to get a job or whatever, they will be made fun of, turned down, and even if they get in, they're abused. This happens in our side, but at least we are able to provide them the safety mechanisms so that they don't get abused, so that they are able to guarantee a job. So if the next problem is, they're systemically barred to get a job, this is my very favorite Occam's razor moment. As the government, you give them a job. That's the literal reason for this entire program. This is how they dig themselves worse. They say data will get skewed. Quick panel, ask yourself this. Which one is more skewed as data? Having constant data intake or having to assume data because you do not have actual data analysis because no one is going to comply with your requirements at the very end of the day? Sure, I'll take the POI.
Data is going to be skewed because the people who need it most are not going to opt in. So how is this data even useful in the first place?
Because the data is still provided by the people who are literally under your welfare system at the very end of the day. Of course, data is skewed, but in your side, you do not have proper extrapolation content because there is no data at the very end of the day. So you have to assume you're just giving money to who knows where and who God knows where, and understand that, hey, I'm going to lose money without any proper, let's say, for example, return of investment, or without any proper ability to be able to push for accountability for our systems at the very end of the day. So even if our systems fail, we still have to keep constantly giving without understanding maybe our system is not working properly. At least in our side, we have the ability to be able to check and understand. And even though they're going to skew the data, they still have the incentive to be able to understand and analyze the data, so they're able to make sure that the system is going to be much better coming from their side. In fact, in your side, data is more skewed because you do not have the ability to be able to provide the data, since the data is not there. What does government need to do then to be able to save their case? Three things. Note, repeal their counterfactual because they don't acknowledge that this opportunity cost exists anyway, but because they have more faulty systems for welfare to work programs absentee rise, we argue the opportunity cost is worse because the people who opt into welfare to work programs in their side have worse off safety mechanisms, and now they end up going back to these welfare to work programs, and now there's more incentive to lay them off. But then secondly, answer the explicit weighing. We talked about how all of their benefits are non-exclusive, and we can still have hospitals and stimulus checks because, surprise, surprise, multiple things can happen inside government side. Thirdly, deal with their unreasonability. Not only are they swearing in front of a minor, but they assume that everyone will suddenly not help them because they do not get a job. Note, a welfare to work job, and let's read the motion, provides welfare until you can get a job. You do not need a job so that you get the welfare. That's why it's called welfare to work. Meaning, you do not need a job to get the welfare, which already kills the entire case on, oh my God, I need a job, or else the government will not subsidize me, because that's literally the prerequisite to be able to get a job. Sadly, it's too late, so they fail. Like the women and poor and disabled individuals in their side, when they realize it's too late to get a job because they weren't helped by the state. Propose.